All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Nefesh podcast. This is episode 22, and I'm so excited that we have a good friend of mine, Heather King, that we've known each other for a long time. You're going to be sharing your story about your journey through discovering that you have the celiac disease. That's what it's called, right? As far as a disease, an autoimmune disease that you and your daughter discovered that you and she had, and the journey that it's been, the process of managing it, and really, again, sharing the story of what that's been like. And, you know, people such as myself really didn't know about it. I feel like I've been educated just by you talking with you and you sharing your story. And recently I've gone off gluten, and so I feel so prepared to go off gluten because of all the conversations that I've had with you. But welcome to the show, and thanks for being on and being willing to share. And then you also have your own website, and you're essentially trying to help others through this process. Let me get the website out there, and we'll make sure to share it again at the end. What's the name of it?
It's goglutenfreely.com. And that's also my handle on just about any social media at goglutenfreely.
Goglutenfreely.com. Awesome. Well, welcome once again. And so take us back through the kind of the initial phases, the initial discovery of celiac, and inform anybody who doesn't know what it is, and you know what that process has been like.
Sure. So I'll start with the definition of celiac disease. You mentioned it's an autoimmune disease, and autoimmune means your body is attacking itself. In the case of celiac disease, we actually know more about what causes it or what the trigger is than most other autoimmune diseases. So when someone with celiac disease ingests gluten, our bodies think that it's an invader, and we mount an immune response to that virus or germ or terrible thing, gluten, in our body. And then our body misfires, and instead of attacking the gluten, which it sees as harmful, it attacks our own intestines. And so that's the autoimmune part, where your immune system is attacking itself.
So is this not quite the same thing when we talk about allergies? You know, your body, when you're having an allergic response to something, your body goes into it thinks there's some type of foreign invasion, and it hypes up, what is it, like the histamine or something. It's responding to something that it sees as an issue. So you might start sneezing, you might start, itching all over, or if you've got, whatever it might be, especially if any like hay fever type of allergy. In this case, your body responds by attacking its own self. Is that the kind of the definition of autoimmune?
Yes. And I do want to clarify, I'm not a doctor. I am a celiac patient. But yes, it's similar to an allergy in that the immune system is misfiring and recognizing something as harmful that's not actually harmful. But in the case of an autoimmune disease, you're attacking your own body in some way. And different autoimmune diseases attack different organs. But for celiac disease, it's the small intestine, the part of the intestine that absorbs a lot of nutrients. So vitamin B, iron, D12. And so people with celiac disease can have a whole host of symptoms, not just the traditional GI symptoms. And you can have neuropathy and brain fog and osteoporosis, fatigue, emotional disturbances.
I think you've described everybody saying I've got celiac.
Well, I will say this is my PSA. If you have any of those symptoms and you don't have a diagnosis that explains those symptoms, it's worth talking to your doctor and asking to see if they can do a celiac blood test, because the numbers vary based on the study, but anywhere between 70 to 90% of celiac patients are undiagnosed.
Wow.
And so it really goes missed because it's all of these unusual symptoms that could be related to
a
any
bunch
number
of other things.
Yeah, it's not always celiac.
And it will show up later, for example, in like they'll come in with colon cancer or other things that may have gotten missed prior to And so obviously they're only going to focus on the cancer and dealing with that as opposed to what may have led to it, right?
Yes. And certainly if you've got something going on where a GI is scoping you, they should be able to identify it when they're scoping you and doing biopsies anyway, even if they haven't done a blood test. The biopsy and endoscopy is more thorough. But yes, people present with much more severe symptoms because you could go decades being malnourished and think of all of the ramifications that has for other body systems, not the
Right.
GI system. And so going decades with all those other things going on, you can accumulate other autoimmune diseases, other serious illnesses. And so getting celiac disease diagnosed and treated is really important. And the treatment is in some ways very simple. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we
Sure.
get into our story. And in other ways, very complicated.
Right. So for you, how did it present itself? It first started with your daughter, right? And some of the issues that she was having.
Yeah, so her symptoms were initially not very obvious, but she did have some. When you have children, you take them to the doctor every, like initially every couple months and then every 6 months, and they watch them on this growth chart, and they follow kids who are developing properly, follow this little arc, a perfect little line, and they stay, growing properly. And pediatricians watch to see if there's a change. Well, my daughter had at her 2-year appointment, I think 2.5-year appointment, jumped down a line. So she wasn't continuing to grow properly.
Wow.
But it wasn't significant enough that it, rang alarm bells. It was just, oh, well, watch this. There was a change. And she was complaining about tummy aches a lot, which is not terribly unusual for small children either, but she was complaining of regular tummy aches. And so one day she had what I still think was just an intestinal virus, and she was complaining her tummy hurt. And she happened to be eating toast at the same time. And so my husband pipes in with, oh, it's probably celiac disease.
And if you know your husband, like somehow he managed to be right on target, because that is
yes, he was right on. But I thought this was hilarious because the
right.
child was 3.5 and had been eating, gluten products since she started eating any solid food. And so
Right.
I certainly did not think this piece of toast had thrown her over the edge into celiac disease. And so I took her to the doctor. Her regular pediatrician wasn't available. And so I took her to another physician in the practice who happened to be gluten intolerant. So she was very, alert to those things.
Okay.
I mentioned as a joke, oh, my husband thinks she has celiac disease because she was eating toast. And I'm laughing. And she's like, I think I'm going to test her. And
Wow.
she was looking at the big picture. She was looking at the growth curve, and she was looking
Okay.
at the stomach complaints. And and then that comment just kind of triggered in her mind, I'm going to go ahead and test her. But it wasn't very obvious. Her symptoms weren't classic by any definition, but the doctor was astute and aware, and she did a blood test and it came back positive. And I was shocked, but
Yeah.
because there weren't tremendous obvious signs. And so that they followed up the blood test with an endoscopy, which in the United States, rarely will a doctor diagnose without the endoscopy. It's still considered the gold standard.
And that involves going in, and they going down into your stomach and what, into your intestines as well.
Yeah, so it's
And
through
then
the
taking a
mouth,
biopsy.
stomach. Yes, yeah. So they send a camera down, they take samples, and they can see that her villi, which are these little finger-like things that grow on the intestine that absorb nutrients, they were flattening. And so that was why she wasn't growing properly and
So
why her stomach was hurting.
why is that significant? I know it feels like we're going back to high school biology, but why are those things, why is it that they're flattened? What does that signify?
So the flattening is our immune system, celiac immune system, attacking the villi. We destroy
Oh,
them. And so as we destroy them, they can't absorb the nutrients.
okay.
So more than you ever wanted to know about your intestines. But there you go.
Well, that makes sense, where, they want to grab the food just like we always
Yeah.
want to eat. Yeah, I get it. Okay.
So, and that was the other thing. She was always hungry because she wasn't getting her her needs met. So I would say those were her symptoms early on.
Okay.
After she was taken off gluten, we had this one little lapse. And again, this is another PSA. If you are being tested for celiac disease and your blood indicates that you have it, or you otherwise think that you have it, you should stay on gluten until you see a gastroenterologist because
Okay.
you need to do that endoscopy when you're still on gluten.
Okay.
So the pediatrician told us to go off. The GI immediately said, go back on gluten. And she developed a violent reaction
Oh
to
my
where she
gosh.
just vomits like she has food poisoning anytime she eats gluten. And so that was a difficult few weeks until we could get her in to get scoped.
So the
Um,
pediatrician told you go off because
mhm.
she found that you went off, then you went in to see the gastroenterologist.
Enterologist.
Thank you. And he says, no, you got to stay on it in order for us to be able to see the effects. So she's going through this process of violent, like vomiting and various other things while waiting to then get scoped.
Yes. So
Wow.
really seeing the GI is a critical step in the
Yeah.
process to avoid that happening.
Right.
Um, And so anyway, we got her scoped and I was nervous. My baby was going under anesthesia and she wakes up and they give her popsicle and she's, eating her little popsicle and she's like, so what are we going to do today? I'm like, "I already did it, baby. I'm done." Like,
She's
so
all good.
yeah, she was good. It was no biggie. So, and being young, it was a good age to be diagnosed. And when I look back at her diagnosis and mine that followed, I consider it a miracle
Mm.
because the the average age to be diagnosed for celiac disease, I just saw it today. The National Celiac Association said it's 50.
Oh
And
my gosh.
and
People
so
are not getting diagnosed until they're 50. And so that's a whole lifetime of
mhm.
issues and
And it
problems.
and it
And
can trigger at any time. So maybe they
okay,
didn't all have it at 2, maybe some of
sure.
them had it at 30, but most celiacs are reporting taking years to get diagnosed, like seeking a diagnosis and trying to figure out what's wrong with them and it taking a long time. So the fact that we found out so quickly while she was young that she didn't have to make a big adjustment. She doesn't remember eating gluten. Like there are
Okay.
things I walk past, Annie's pretzels and I remember eating gluten.
Yeah,
She doesn't remember, so she doesn't know what
right.
she's missing.
That's
And
true.
so that's been really good. And then just health-wise to know that
Yeah,
she's not going to have that long-term damage because the
right.
really cool thing about celiac disease, if there's anything cool about it, is that they know what causes it and they know how to treat it.
Right.
So, I mean, they don't know what makes the gene trigger in the first place, why, 60% of us have the celiac gene. They don't know why it triggered in me and maybe
Right.
you have it, not in you. But they know that it's the gluten that causes it.
Okay.
And so, once it's triggered, it's the
Right.
gluten that causes the autoimmune reaction. So if you don't eat gluten, you don't
You're
have a
fine.
reaction. Yeah.
Right.
So wheat, barley, rye, and then anything that's contaminated in the field. So like oats are gluten free, but they're usually contaminated.
Now, is it always true, and you may be getting to this, um, not everybody has the same reaction, right? And is it possible that some people don't have, like for you, for example, you get really tired, right?
Yes. Yes.
And Eliana is throwing up and has those she has those issues, but for other people it may not be as extreme. Is it possible that it can be ignored, like if you get a little piece of gluten, it's not as bad?
So no, the
Okay.
symptoms are different from the damage. So when I was
Right.
diagnosed,
Right.
I did not have obvious symptoms. I thought in hindsight there was the fatigue,
Sure.
but I was parenting small children, and so I
Right.
thought it was just due to parenting small children. And then once I got diagnosed and treated, I had more energy, and my energy level is fabulous now. So I know there was that, and my vitamin levels were decreased, so there were those signs, pointing to that being the cause. But um, but there are people who are like me. I thought I was asymptomatic. It wasn't obvious, but there are people who actually are asymptomatic who don't have any symptoms, or they have symptoms they can live with. So
Okay.
like you think about the person who's lactose intolerant and they decide they want to eat ice cream and pizza and their
Yeah.
stomach hurts and then they just kind of go on their way. The
Right.
problem with celiac disease is you really can't cheat. So
Mm.
the treatment, the only treatment right now, and they're working on other treatments, but the only existing treatment is a strict lifelong gluten-free diet. No
And
cheat.
and why? So that's the part that I think is not as clear. And I know you've mentioned through your journey that you've encountered people who are like, oh yeah, I think I have that too, but I cheat every once in a while. And you're like, no, you can't, because the damage, it's not like, again, like if you're lactose intolerant and you just, your stomach is upset, then you're over it maybe the next day. The damage that is done through even just the very littlest of gluten is what?
Well, it's so as small. So there's the experts say that we can't have more than 20 parts per million. If you had a million breadcrumbs, like we couldn't have 20. So
Wow.
it's such a tiny little bit of gluten that we can tolerate. And so if you're having a bite or a slice of pizza or any amount of gluten, your body is building an autoimmune response. And even if you aren't feeling symptoms, your GI system will show that your intestines are being damaged. You're not able to absorb nutrients. It's the same thing as if you were starving. If
Okay.
you did not have access to good nutrition, good food, you were living in a developing nation and very, very poor, the life expectancy would be low, the health outcomes would be bad because you're not getting any nutrition. And that's really horrifying.
With
Um,
one bite, it sends your autoimmune response, body responding and causing damage to your intestine and to other parts.
Yes, and I will clarify that everybody's body is different. So what the exact amount is, we don't know for each person, but we're talking the difference between 10 parts per million and 40 parts per million. We're
Yeah.
not talking about even a bite.
Wow.
Like so so there should be no cheating on the gluten-free diet if you have celiac disease. If you
Right.
have gluten intolerance, that's a whole different animal, maybe many different animals.
Right.
But for celiac disease, we cannot cheat because the damage is inside even if we feel fine.
Even if you can't see it, yeah.
Mhm.
So after you going back to your own discovery of it, after you found out that your daughter had it, you pulled her off, then it was about, okay, where did this potentially come from, right? Because it's genetic.
Yes. So the expert advice is that if you have a first degree relative with celiac disease, so a sibling, a parent, a child, that all of the first degree relatives should get tested. And
Okay.
so we did. Although I must say I dragged my feet on me because I was fine. I
Sure.
don't have celiac disease. And my husband has all these like sensitive GI symptoms. And so
Yeah.
I tested, he tested and I tested my son right away, of course. And then they were both negative. And so I'm like, oh, I better, test myself. And they called me back and they're like, oh, it looks like you have a touch of celiac disease,
A
which
touch of it.
touch of it. By then I knew enough to know that nobody has a touch of celiac
Yeah.
disease. And and I had it. And my husband, when I told him, he's like, it was you. Neither of us could believe it. And they scoped me, and my intestines were worse than my daughter's. So I had all
Really?
kinds of damage, did not know. And even after that, I immediately went off gluten after I did my endoscopy. I never cheated, but there were times where she would accidentally get gluten and we had eaten the same food. And so I assumed that I had. And the only symptom I would have was a couple weeks later because the damage was there. And so it'd be a couple weeks of not absorbing vitamins. A couple weeks later, I would notice that I was tired. And
Really?
so
It would take a
somebody,
couple weeks for it to
a couple
affect you.
weeks. Yeah. And so that was the only symptom I had. And I also noticed about a week or two later that she would be much more emotional. And so we had
Interesting.
these not obvious symptoms, but they were
Okay.
there. And she had that in addition to the vomiting. And so, yeah, but now it's changed. So now that I've been off of gluten for nearly 8 years, I now have a violent
Do
reaction if
you?
I am accidentally cross-contaminated. Yeah.
Even just the slightest. So explain that to me a little bit more. Why is it that early on, when there was so much damage, it would take a while for you to feel the uh, for you to feel it?
I think that's
Was your
just
body just used to it, and so
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of that, like you get used to feeling crummy, but I don't know why it changes, but I hear this anecdotally from other people that some
okay,
people don't react at all, and then after being off for a long time, then their symptoms are much more severe. So it's not uncommon. I don't know the biology behind that.
okay,
But my thinking regarding why it wasn't instantaneous before with the fatigue is just because the fatigue was a result of low vitamins, and that low
ah,
vitamin level didn't take place immediately. That would be
okay.
after a week or two of not absorbing vitamin B, B12, then I would start to feel fatigued. That's
So
that's my non-medical theory.
so for you now, it's not even so much the fatigue; it's a violent digestive
Mhm.
response.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's
Interesting.
awful. I don't recommend it. So,
No.
um,
So what
but
has that been like? I mean, you're pretty strong. You're a trooper. You kind of tackle things head on, but I mean, gluten has some really nice stuff. One of those for you, I think, was a particular drink at Starbucks, right? That you couldn't get anymore.
yeah,
Kind of the like, I
yeah.
mean, these are I know it's first world problems, but this is how we live, right?
Yeah, and you know what? All around the world, in every country, there's an emotional attachment to food. And
Mm,
so food is part of how we connect to people.
mm,
It's part of how we celebrate. It's part of
right.
how we mourn. It's part of, everyday experiences. It just, there's so much attached to food that's really hard to describe. So having
Mm,
to change your diet so significantly is huge. And
right.
um, I will say for me, it wasn't as big a shift because when my daughter was diagnosed, we took the whole house gluten-free. She was little. I was concerned about cross-contamination and being able to keep her safe. And
Can you
also,
Can you
Mhm.
explain that a little bit further? Again,
Sure.
people may not understand like what that means. When we're talking about going gluten free, it's not just not buying stuff with gluten in it. I mean, it goes even beyond that to what types of plates or things that you can use to cook with, or you're avoiding any type of cross contamination whatsoever.
So what that looked like was a complete clean out of my house. And you think about the way you bake. You might take a cup of flour and then take that same cup and dip it in the sugar to take a cup of
Right?
sugar. We've all done that. Well,
Right?
now sugar's cross-contaminated with flour, and
Wow.
that's happening all over the kitchen. And so thinking about if you take mayonnaise and you stick your knife in the mayonnaise and rub it on the bread, and then you stick that, knife back in the mayonnaise,
Yeah.
you're transferring the bread to the mayonnaise, um, sharing a toaster. You take your pasta and you dump it into the colander, and some bits and pieces can get stuck between the cracks that might be there, and they're no big deal unless you have celiac disease and they're gluten.
Wow.
Wooden spoons, cutting boards, things that are porous that can absorb the gluten in the liquid and be there next time you're cooking or cutting. Those things are all contaminated. So I replace them. Things that are fine are dishes. Like many people choose because of, like if I were the only one with celiac disease, I probably wouldn't have taken my house gluten free. But I was
Sure.
dealing with a 3-year-old
Sure.
and had a 5-year-old and just didn't feel like I could keep her safe. But if it were me, I might have been like, oh, I can do it. Gluten free food's more expensive. And
Sure.
so economically, if you have a big family, it's not always possible to take everybody gluten free.
Sure.
So and they do that and they share pans. They just have dedicated cutting boards and
So
dedicate.
specific things that might absorb the gluten, other things may not.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So as long as like a pan that you wouldn't use a cast iron pan, that's porous.
Okay.
So if you need to use a cast iron pan, then you'd have a gluten one and a gluten-free one if you're in a shared household. So
Wow.
I had to take all my stuff since we weren't doing shared and got rid of anything that could be either contained gluten or was cross-contaminated or could be used to cross-contaminate my food, like utensils. And I donated it, gave it away, and had to start from scratch. But then once you do that, like that initial phase is like drinking out of a fire hose because you're like, I don't know what has gluten in it. And you're reading labels, and the kids are crying in the grocery aisle, and you're looking up stuff on your phone, and people are staring at you because you must be a terrible parent. Like it's chaos.
Yeah.
And then it's not. Then it's
Wow.
easy. So it's really a really steep learning curve, and then it gets so much better really fast. And so once I took my house gluten free, that part became easy. Everything in my house is gluten free, and over the years, I've gotten very adept at making anything we want gluten free. I found this flour in Italy because the pizzas there are so good. The gluten-free pizzas are so good.
Really?
Yes, and they use this flour. It's called Caputo gluten-free flour, and it's made with wheat starch. And so that right away, like alarm bells go off for a
Sure.
celiac. It's made with
Yeah.
wheat starch, but the gluten is removed. And it's if it's done and tested properly, it is considered safe for celiacs, but not for people with a wheat allergy.
Oh,
Anyway,
really? Okay.
yeah, because it still has wheat in it, but
Oh, okay.
people with celiac disease are reacting to the protein in wheat, barley, and rye, and
Which is gluten?
which is gluten. So if you remove the gluten protein, which is what happens with wheat starch, and the starch is what's left, and so
So,
we don't react to that.
so that over the last few years, well, several years, I've always had digestive issues, right? And I've wondered whether or not I've had celiac. I did have an endoscopy years ago. They looked at the biopsy. They said it didn't reflect anything. But I have been off gluten over the last 3 years, and it seems to make a difference as far as not necessarily that I feel better, but when I'm on gluten, I have reactions. But maybe I've been off gluten, but not necessarily off wheat, or no, wait,
If
off.
you're off gluten, you're off wheat.
Okay, but there is something that's, wait, so now I don't understand. So you've got
Okay,
the wheat starch that
you're
doesn't have
probably not. Yeah.
gluten,
Okay.
but if you have a wheat allergy,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I don't understand.
Okay, so wheat starch is such a rare thing.
Okay,
Char makes a few products with wheat starch. In the United States, there aren't too many things made with wheat starch. It's very common in Italy. So
okay,
you're probably not eating wheat starch. So
okay.
technically, you could be eating wheat starch. And if your problem is wheat and not gluten, then the wheat starch would bother you. So that'd be a fabulous way to find out, or not so fabulous.
To eat
Um,
something with, so
with
basically
wheat
see how
starch,
I feel if I eat something with, so I guess the question is, it is possible to have an item that is gluten-free, but not
wheat free. That's correct.
wheat-free.
That's correct. So
Oh,
one of the like there's a pizza on the market. I think it's DiGiorno's pizza.
okay,
I think DiGiorno, and it is made with wheat starch. And so it'll say wheat on it. It contains wheat. Wheat is it has to be a declared allergen.
right,
Gluten is not. So in the United States, the gluten-free claim is voluntary. Wheat is not voluntary. It has to be there. So
why?
it'll say gluten on the front, and then when you read the ingredients, it'll say contains wheat, which is confusing, but
Right.
it's that wheat starch.
So
So
I typically look at the item, and if it says contains wheat, then I don't, even if it doesn't say gluten-free, I don't.
and that's a pretty safe bet with most products in the United
So
States. I
why
mean, I
is
think
that
I just named the two that
necessary?
aren't. So
Huh?
I think I just named the two that aren't, the DiGiorno pizza and the
Okay.
Char breads.
But why, that may be a whole separate question. Well, it is a whole separate question. Why is it that they have to declare wheat on there but not gluten?
Oh, I could get on a soapbox for a while. It's the FDA labeling law, and there are people that are
They don't care about
petitioning
celiacs?
Congress. Well, they're petitioning Congress to try to get that changed. So
Okay.
there are allergens that are labeled. Gluten is not an allergy, it's autoimmune. And so it's in a
Um,
different category. So they created a whole set of rules for gluten, but it leaves people with celiac disease in this rare spot where we can get gluten by accident. We have to check things so much more carefully. It's very difficult because
right,
unless something has a gluten-free label on it,
right,
which is voluntary, we don't know if it's gluten-free because there are ways to hide things like barley and rye. So something could say natural ingredients and it contains rye, and they don't have to disclose it. So anytime I see natural ingredients, I have to put it back on the shelf unless it
Really?
has a gluten-free claim on the label.
Wait, so
Or the manufacturer.
the category natural ingredients can include things like rye and barley. It doesn't have to disclose that.
It doesn't have to disclose it because those are not one of the top 8 allergens. So, and I think they're adding a ninth allergen. I don't know if it's sesame. A ninth allergen is going to be added in January, but it's not gluten yet. So we're still working on that. It
Wow.
really needs
Okay.
to be added. In Europe, it is disclosed. They'll
Okay.
disclose, they call it cereals. So anything that contains cereals, which would include wheat, barley, rye, oats, any grain,
Interesting.
that's disclosed. So we're not left in this like no man's land.
Yeah.
Um, but to go back to your question about you,
Yeah.
so it's very rare to have something that's gluten-free that contains wheat in the
Okay.
United States. It is
Okay.
rare. But if you see it, then you know it has wheat in it.
Okay.
Um, and you might want to avoid it. But the other thing is you might just be reacting to wheat. If
To
it's not
wheat.
the gluten protein that's bothering you, it could just be wheat, and you might be fine with barley and rye.
So what would be the I mean, other than being able to eat barley and rye, like that's it. Like, I mean,
That's it.
I don't drink beer, so I don't need, right? Like
Yeah. Barley soup. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, wheat is the biggie.
Okay, okay,
Yeah, but you would just look for that contains wheat statement. I mean, that would be the
okay.
advantage is the label reading would sure get a lot easier.
Well, I remember, and things have changed. What has it been, 8 years since you've had it? Things have changed. And I know that you mentioned this even way back then when you were having to make this huge change, that today it's a lot easier to go off gluten than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. A lot of more things are being labeled, more things are being marketed. I know that. And that's one of the things I want you to touch on is that there are so many fads today,
Mm.
and eating fads, health fads, lifestyle fads. It would be easy to dismiss this as, and I joked around about it earlier, a first world problem.
Mhm.
What do you, because there are some who will say, our ancestors ate wheat and gluten for whatever X amount of years that you want to put in there, and they didn't have a problem. How do you address that? Is this based upon what you've read and done research? Is this something that's been around for a while? Is this something that has only been recently either discovered, or it's been recently, it's come out as a result of our wheat consumption?
So in my research, it's been around,
Okay.
and they discovered the gluten connection during one of the wars. I think it was World War One. It
Okay.
was kids that were, I think it was in Ireland. I'm going to mess up the story, but I think it was kids in Ireland that were in the hospital for malnutrition, and
Wow.
there were bread shortages and bread rationing, and
Okay.
so they would improve when they wouldn't get bread, and then they would get bread and they would get worse, and so
Wow.
that's when they realized what was going on. So it's been in the last 100 years
Okay.
that they've figured out this connection, and that's where I think it's really a blessing with the celiac disease. If you're going to have an autoimmune disease, to have one that they know, and this is how they stumbled across the cause, and have been able to figure out how to treat it. So
Okay.
so the understanding of it has grown,
Mm.
and certainly in the last 20 years or so, there's been a whole bunch of research. If you look at the NIH website, you can see all the studies that are being done. There's funding behind the research. There are charities raising funds. There are celiac organizations at different universities that are now funding research. And so they're understanding more and more. But there's a long way to go. And a big part of that is getting towards a treatment that's not just the gluten-free diet because of the
Right.
complications of the cross-contamination and how difficult it is, and some of the extra burdens of managing the disease. The Celiac Disease Foundation did a study one time, and they asked celiac patients, about the burden of the disease, and their responses were that like compared to those dealing with end-stage kidney cancer,
Mm.
kidney disease, that it was as severe as dealing with end stage kidney disease. Like that's the burden and toll on celiac patients. That's
Mm,
pretty significant. And I
yeah,
know it sounds like, oh, it's just food, but it's constant. You eat every day,
right,
multiple times, and
right,
you have to think about food. And again, those social components that I mentioned, those things, it's a heavy burden. And
right.
some people are doing it in isolation. And
Mm.
so there's just an emotional side and a mental health side that's significant. So
And the cost of now having been doing it the last 3 years, it is the gluten-free foods are more expensive still. I mean, there's some that it's getting better, but it's a costlier thing. Now you can manage by, maybe making your own stuff, but they're like, if you want to substitute
mhm.
anything, and you probably have some life hacks for that, but it's not something that is easily, it's easier. It's not still not the easiest to access. And as you said, like being aware of, even if you have to eat out, fast food or restaurant options. And I know you've been doing that for a while, and are sharing that even on your website. But there is that, yeah, that constant thinking about what it is that you're going to need to do, how you're going to need to adjust, where you can go, where it's safe to go. I mean, you've taken your family really all over and done everything, Disney cruises and all Europe and all that, and have had to do a ton of research to prepare for it.
Yes, I will say you don't have to do any research for Disney cruise. They take really good care of you on
Okay.
the Disney cruise ship. So, but just about anything else, it's a lot of work. We're getting ready for a trip to Europe in a week, and I'm looking at all the places, every place we're going to go. I have to find the restaurants and when are they open, and so figuring out all those details. It's just it is a tremendous amount of work, but I decided when my daughter was diagnosed and it flowed through to my life, but looking at this 3-year-old girl, like I wasn't going to let her miss out on anything. And so just like any challenge you have, it makes you stronger. There are advantages that come along with the disadvantages. And she's certainly a fabulous self-advocate and has developed all these skills through this challenge.
Right.
But I didn't want her to ever think that she couldn't. And
Yeah.
so one of the games we played early on was we would talk about, when you're 3, you play silly little card games, and we would play the game of naming all the things she could eat. And we would just take turns. I would name a food and she would name a food. Instead of thinking about all the things you can't, think
Yeah.
about what you can eat.
Yeah.
And so that's just been my attitude. We can do everything. So
Mm.
if people are having a party, we can be there. We might have to bring our own food. They might be
Right.
able to make something for us. It just, it's different every time, but we're going to be there and we're not going to miss out.
Yeah.
And the same thing with traveling. Traveling is important to our family. And so we're
Mm.
going to do it. And that's really a big part of like how my blog has really transformed recently in terms of helping other people, because now I'm 8 years down the road. A lot of this is, even though it's work, it's really mindless. I know what to do. And
Mm.
if she comes home and she's like, oh mom, we're having this event and I need this and this and this and this, I know off the top of my head 20 things I can do to make it work. And so
Right.
all of that is just experience and the people that helped me 8 years ago. And so I realized I've got all this stuff in my brain and I want to dump it out of my brain and get it out there to help other people so that they can travel and they can send their kids to a gingerbread house decorating party and their child can do a sleepover and they can go to Thanksgiving and enjoy it.
And when you say research, like, I don't think people realize you have done research. Like, you should have gotten a whole other degree in this, because I mean, you thoroughly, extensively, and are almost, you're not an MD, but like an encyclopedia
Not an MD.
of celiac, but and covering such a wide range of everything from, again, places that you can go to, the effects of it, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's so cool, your website and your blog, what you're doing with that, because that is absolutely something that is going to help so many people. I mean, you had to do the research and lay all this groundwork, but it's going to be such a blessing to others.
Yeah. And it's exciting to me when I can see the numbers and the people are like, oh, people are reading this recipe or they're reading this article and they're planning their trips to Greece or Italy or whatever. And I know how much I rely on those resources.
Mm.
And so it's exciting to be able to share that, where before it would just be talking to somebody, sharing information. Oh, I found this, or I found that, or I had this idea, or this worked, and sharing it one on one. But to be able to share it, this like multiply the stuff I've learned in terms of making a difference, because it is legit a
Mm.
challenge, and I jump on social media and I see how people are struggling, and you
Well,
know,
and you mentioned, one of the things, one of the concerns, or that you've discovered, is that some people with celiac struggle with even eating disorders because of that. Is that
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, so there's a higher correlation with eating disorders because the disease requires that you be vigilant, almost
Mm,
obsessive about your food. And so,
right,
I mean, it's important to balance not being crazy and not being obsessive and
right.
still being vigilant and safe and careful. And it's
Yeah.
just such a fine line. And so it's very easy to cross over. And then you have folks who cheat. We talked about that because they want to feel normal, or
Yeah.
they miss a food, or all their friends are eating pizza. And, it's
Yeah.
especially difficult for young people. And there are people with food insecurity. You
Yeah.
mentioned how the food is more expensive. Some of the products are twice as expensive to get, gluten-free bread. You're spending twice as much, and the loaf is half the size.
Yes.
And, and it might have holes in it.
Yes.
You've seen that, yeah.
Yes.
And so it's expensive. And
Yeah.
so I'll see on social media people posting, we're at the end of the month and all I have in my pantry is the gluten food that I have for the kids. And it's like I either eat that or I don't eat. And so
Mm,
people are dealing with that. And then the social pieces are big. I've worked very hard for my daughter to be able to do everything. And for me as an adult, it's very easy. Like I went to a comedy club with friends and they couldn't feed me, but you had to buy stuff. And so I was like, okay, I'll buy two sparkling waters and I'll eat my kind bar. And just, I'm like, whatever, I don't care. I'm an adult. And my
yeah.
friends didn't care and we were all
Yeah.
perfectly happy. But for a teenager, for
Mm,
example, that's much more difficult to be like, oh, I'm going to sit here with my granola bar and everyone else is eating pizza or burgers. And so there's that challenge. But my daughter last year, she was invited to a birthday party and then she was uninvited. And the friend said, "Well, you can't come because I'm not going to have any food for you. And I know you can bring your own, but I'll just feel bad if you can't eat what I have."
oh my
And and
gosh.
obviously it's a 10-year-old girl
Oh,
who, is they're all learning, but it was devastating to
yeah.
her. She just wants to be
Yeah.
included in everything.
Right.
And so to have that happen, and I know it's not the last time and probably
Sure.
not the first time. I'm sure there are times we're not invited and we don't know that, she was, told that she wasn't invited. So,
Oh, that's
there's
so
that. And
sad.
people talk about like going to family events
Mm,
and their mother or mother-in-law, but sometimes their mother will put a little gluten in their food because they're like, oh, it's just a little, it's fine. And then the person's sick on a holiday. And so there are all these, there's this anxiety
yeah.
from being gluten. Like if it makes you very sick, there's anxiety associated with that. So
Well,
they're
and
difficult things.
I know you've got a great family that's supportive, but I've got, other friends who have other various, not celiac, but other allergies to various foods, and they try to adapt. And um, this is kind of what was my earlier question, that I think there are some people who do think that these things are fads and that this is just a preference, and they're either not as supportive or just downright, hey, like you said, they'll put a little gluten in the food or whatever, or put a little whatever dairy in, because they don't see how big of a deal it is. And especially in it, I almost feel bad comparing, like a wheat allergy to celiac, because those are two very different things. So uh, an allergy or lactose intolerant, again, it doesn't do lifelong damage just by that little bit that you ingest, unless
But
you're
an allergy could kill you immediately.
that's
So,
true.
like if we're
That's true.
saying, which disease is worse, I mean, there's certainly
That's true. If you have a
everything
peanut
has
allergy and you
challenges.
ingest
Yeah.
it and your throat closes up, then yeah, of
Yeah.
course. Right.
So
Right.
it can be dangerous. And you're right. It is a problem when people don't take it seriously. I think this is where finding a community is important. So finding a local support group for celiac disease, finding an online support group, reading blogs, my blog, there are hundreds of blogs about celiac disease, but reading those things where you can realize you're not alone, because a
Mm,
lot of people, they're the only one in their family that's been diagnosed, and there may be other people with celiac disease, but if they're not getting tested, they don't know, and so they feel alone, and they're being isolated within their families or within their friend group. And so
right.
finding out that you're not alone is really important. I mean, I even see my daughter come alive when she gets on. They do these groups on Zoom with I think it's the Celiac Association, and
Oh,
it's kids.
cool.
It's all kids, middle school
Yeah.
kids, and she gets on there and she's just so excited and the energy's high, and because they're like, oh, my people, you know what it
Mm,
feels like. And so connecting with other people that understand, sharing ideas, helping each other, it makes a big difference. So you're not alone.
yeah.
When my daughter was diagnosed with celiac before I was, she prayed that I would have celiac
Are you
disease.
serious?
Yeah. So a little
He may
three-year-old
have given it
girl
to you.
asking, I don't know. We don't know because my son's first child. We don't know. But I tell her she has
That's
very powerful
funny.
prayers. But that same desire not to be
Mm,
alone.
right.
And there's a part of me that's thankful that her prayer
Yeah.
was answered, that she's not alone in her
Yeah.
celiac and not
So
feeling isolated. She's got a gluten-free buddy.
So now for celiac, I think you mentioned this earlier, it is possible that it's something that they don't know. So it is and can be genetic, but it is also something that you can develop later, or do you have the gene and then sometimes develop it later, or
Yeah,
is
so like I said, 60% of people have the gene and don't have celiac disease. So
okay,
the gene is very common. They
okay.
think about 1% of the population actually has celiac disease. So you can see the discrepancy between who has
Wow.
the gene and who actually has celiac disease. It's a very small number.
Yeah.
So the gene doesn't mean you have celiac disease. But almost never do you have celiac disease without the gene.
Okay.
Occasionally I'll hear anecdotally again about a diagnosis and they think maybe that they haven't found another gene that's correlated, but
Okay.
that's very, very rare. So if you don't, you can get the genetic testing to find out you don't have celiac disease. It's like a test that will exclude celiac disease. So if
But
you,
essentially that only means you're one of 40 of the 40% that don't have it, right? Because 60% of the
yes,
population do.
yeah,
Okay. So
yeah.
if you have,
So it's
if
not
you,
helpful for diagnosing, but it's helpful
right,
for ruling out
ruling it
celiac
out.
disease.
Okay. But if, so 60% of the population do have the gene, but only 1% then of that, 1% of the population, which is, of that 60% that actually develop celiac, do they know, and
Yeah.
are they able to connect how that happens?
There are a lot of studies. Some they do think that there are triggers, sometimes illness, sometimes pregnancy. But
Um,
it's really hard to, like because you don't know right away. It's not like
yeah.
you get it triggered and then all of a sudden your reactions are so obvious. And so
Okay.
if you're looking back, it's always retroactive. And so, but those are the kinds of things that they seem to think trigger it.
So for you, would it have been pregnancy, or you
I
think
suspect. I mean, I was never tired before then. So
okay,
and I did have some challenges with my second pregnancy. So
right,
I kind of think it was that one.
okay,
But I don't really know because nobody was testing me before.
right.
So yeah, I suspect my second pregnancy, but I have no idea.
So I guess, of this, again, 60% of the population do. It's interesting then the correlation, what causes that 1%. So obviously people have pregnancies, people go through illnesses, people have other things and they don't develop it. What then is the thing that causes, they just don't know.
I don't know.
Okay.
And certainly there are lots of studies on that. They're looking at like how early you introduce gluten to your
Okay.
diet, breastfeeding, all kinds of things.
Is
Vaccines.
that was, so that's another thing in, and others who might, they might talk about was it bioengineering, food, what do they call it, um I
Oh,
don't
like that
know.
that the wheat has changed that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the genetic engineering of the various foods and kind of the mass production of all of those things, and that do they, I guess some people might question that as
Some people
well.
do, but the scientists don't seem to.
Okay.
And if you look at it, there's less of that in Europe than there is in the States. We're allowed to do a lot more to our food that they don't
Mhm.
allow in the European Union. And
Okay.
celiac disease is quite rampant in Europe. So,
Really?
yeah, in fact, it's interesting when I say 60%, I think that's over the whole population, but in Asian population, African population, those numbers are lower. Parts of
Okay.
India, the numbers are higher,
Okay.
interestingly. So it depends where you are on the continent.
Okay.
Your chances of having
Sure.
celiac disease does change by country and region, but the rates are pretty high in Europe. And so when you look at European Americans, the numbers are higher than in other populations. So um,
Wow.
and diagnosis is really high in Italy, for example. So there's a lot of awareness around celiac disease and a lot of
Interesting.
research that's taking place there. And so the
Now
idea,
you're Italian, you're part Italian, right? So
I,
is there any connection there?
well, we don't know because nobody else in my family has tested positive for
That's true.
celiac. So
That's
my
true.
parents were tested, my sister was tested, they were all negative. And so
Okay.
then as long as they're negative, then you don't go to
Can't
another relative.
beyond that. Okay.
Yeah. If one of them were positive, then their first degree relative should be
Sure.
tested.
That's so interesting. It's fascinating. And so at this point, you said that they are, I think they, I don't know, this was a few years ago when we talked about it, but they were developing even a pill that you could take that would help to almost like a lactose pill, right? Did anything
Yeah.
come of
Uh,
that?
There's this joke in the celiac community that's not terribly funny, but it's they're always 10 years away from a cure. So yeah, the research is, I mean, they have stuff in various levels of testing, and it's frankly challenging to recruit people to
Yeah,
be tested because in many cases you have to ingest gluten, and
yeah,
I know how it affects me. In
right.
fact, I signed up when I was asymptomatic. I signed up to be in a study, and then I became symptomatic, and so now I'm like, I don't think I can do the
No,
studies. And so
yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but they're working on things. The
Okay,
stuff they were working on when we talked before was a little better in that it actually would stop the reaction. Right
okay.
now, the stuff that's gotten a little farther along in development is just stopping symptoms. And so
Mm,
it's not as good because you could still have intestinal damage. But frankly, for those of us that have bad symptoms, we'll take what we can get at this point.
right.
And I personally am not interested in a medicine that would stop that would cure celiac disease. I'm fine eating gluten free. I just want something that would prevent my body from damaging itself if I accidentally ingested
Ingest it.
with
Right,
yeah, a small amount through
right.
cross contamination. But I don't have to intentionally eat gluten. Oh, that was why I brought up that flour that makes the wonderful pizza dough. I
Yes.
can make breadsticks and I can make pizza that tastes just like gluten pizza and cinnamon rolls, and I know a bakery in San Francisco where I can get the best croissant, and Disney World makes
Nice.
gluten-free churros. And so
They
whatever you
do?
do, Disney
Wait.
World, not Disneyland. Yeah,
Oh.
sorry. You gotta go to Florida. Um, yeah, that's always a disappointment. They have gluten-free beignets in Disney World too.
Oh,
So, but the point is, you can make anything, you can have anything. So if anyone's listening with celiac disease, like
yeah.
there is a recipe for whatever you want, and you don't have to be deprived.
For you, what do you think has been the biggest I know this is hard to summarize, but the biggest benefit to or the most positive outcome as a result of having this,
Oh, it's hard to say the most.
or one of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to say two.
Sure.
One is better overall health, right? We caught
Mm,
something that was going to kill us
right,
eventually, and
right.
we stopped it, and we have this
Mm,
fix for it. And so we have really good health. My daughter has a very mature palate. Like our diets are varied and interesting, and so I'm thankful for that. But also it creates this open door for kindness.
mm,
Like this opportunity for us to help other people
Yeah.
and other people to help us. And I remember when we were first diagnosed that first Christmas, so it would have just been my daughter, my neighbor came over with a basket full of like gluten-free flour and
Wow.
cookie cutters. And remember, I had cleaned out my kitchen. Well, the cookie
Yeah.
cutters had little like pieces of, crumbs kind
Yeah.
of stuck in the cracks.
Right.
And so those were donated. And so I had these new
Wow.
cookie cutters and a magazine with gluten-free recipes and just little thoughtful things like that. Or when she goes somewhere and someone ordered a gluten-free pizza for her from the one place that makes safe gluten-free pizzas.
Wow.
Or after soccer, when everybody gets a Rice Krispie treat, which contains malt, so that's got gluten in it,
Rice
which it
Krispie
wouldn't say
treats are not okay?
Rice Krispie treats are not okay.
Oh,
No, they're not. No. And Rice Krispies are not for the same reason. They contain malt. You can get off brands though that don't. And then so anyway, everyone's getting their Rice Krispie treats, and another mom had brought her the Rice Krispie treat from Starbucks, which is gluten free.
oh,
And so she
wow.
had, and I know that's like a few bucks, right,
Yeah.
compared to the cheap ones for Walmart.
Yeah.
And
I
so
know exactly what you're talking about. And those
yeah,
things are good
and they're
and
much better.
expensive.
Yeah, they're bigger and they're good. So, but like those kinds of things that just say, I care
Yeah.
about you, I'm going the extra mile, and it creates an opportunity for people to do that. And I
Mm,
don't expect it. Like we prepare, we self-advocate, we take care of ourselves. Like
yeah.
that's another benefit, right? We learn how
Yeah.
to take care of ourselves. She's very self-sufficient. And so it's our job to feed ourselves. But when somebody goes out of their way to make sure we have safe food, like I want to cry. It's really
Mm,
touching. And so it's that opportunity to receive kindness
yeah.
that I think is the best part of this, like the hidden
Yeah.
blessing.
Showing humanity, our care for one another. So for somebody who thinks they might have either a wheat allergy or celiac, what would you say? They're listening, and you say, "All right, here are some good steps to take."
Sure. So I want to distinguish the wheat allergy. You would go
Okay.
see an allergist and they can do tests for that. Um, There's also the elimination diet, which people do for lots of food intolerances,
Hmm.
and that would apply if you have a wheat sensitivity, you could do that. But I want to rewind and go back to what we said earlier that you can't go off gluten until you're tested for celiac disease.
Okay.
So even though the chances of it being celiac disease are very slim, if it's only
Right.
1% of the population, you still want to rule that out before you remove gluten from your diet. So the first step is call your doctor and ask for a blood test. So they'll do a celiac panel, they'll test your blood and see if you have antibodies to gluten. It's very simple. You don't even have to fast for it because if you have them, you're going to have them whether or not you're eating.
Right.
Don't go off gluten. Do the blood test. And then from there, if it's positive, you would follow up with a gastroenterologist
Okay.
and probably do the scope, the endoscopy. And then if it's negative, then you have to look at the intolerances, and that's really out of my area of
Sure.
expertise.
And then, and I think the elimination diet is a good is a good idea, a great idea actually. And I did that. I think that was kind of one of the things that precipitated then me going off it. That I was doing that, and I think I was off maybe eggs, gluten, and something else, and for 21 days, and I added the gluten back in and had a really violent, almost like food poisoning reaction. I and so that can be very helpful to test. And there's a bunch of stuff on websites that talk about various allergies, and I think, like you said, the 8 or 9 allergies that they are, and they kind of walk you through how to do that. I remember in conversations with you that there was something about, so for me, as an example, they did an endoscopy for me to help kind of rule out some of these various issues. I don't know that they ever did like a blood, what is it, a blood panel or a blood
Blood,
test? I
yeah,
blood
yeah.
test. So
Same,
is it the same thing? Well, as
same.
far
Yeah,
as,
blood panel or a blood test,
oh,
same
okay.
thing. Yeah.
So
So
what is the value? Do you essentially need both in order to rule that out? And obviously doctors who are trying to identify that would do the blood test and then the endoscopy. I don't remember why we did that one first and not a blood test, but what is it that are both needed to show what's going on?
No, you could be diagnosed with just an endoscopy.
Okay.
So the question would be to call your GI and say, did you take biopsies? And you think you
Right.
took enough to, to see if
At
I had
various parts
celiac
of
disease. Yeah.
your intestine, right?
Yes.
Not just one area.
Yeah, because if you lay out the small intestine, it's as big as a football field, like between all the
Wow.
folds and everything. So
Each person's
yeah, because of all maybe you're talking about all those little villi and everything. So if you lay it out, it's
a
huge. And so
football field?
yes,
That's so gross.
I know. You're talking tiny little pieces. So it's they need to check different parts of it. And so
Okay.
they'll take multiple samples, but a good GI is gonna, know
Okay.
that and do that. And so you could certainly discuss it with your doctor and see if it makes sense to do a blood test, but you'd have to go back on gluten. But the tell of celiac disease is the intestinal damage.
Okay.
So if you don't have the intestinal damage, well, that's celiac disease.
Okay.
So, you have to have the intestinal damage to have celiac disease.
Got it.
So that I would think you just went right. You cut to the chase and
Right.
did the
Okay.
biopsy.
Okay. Any kind of final, and again, your website, goglutenfreely.com, and really you said anything with that handle, you're pretty much on everything, goglutenfreely.com. Any final thoughts, I guess, for people, either and maybe not even just this, but kind of other similar issues, whether it's dietary restrictions or other things in this category. Final thoughts or tips or reflections?
Well, just thinking about food, I touched on this earlier that it is part of how we celebrate. It is part of how we connect with people. You think about gatherings through every culture celibrates with food.
Right.
And so it's important. And I would just not let this thing, whatever it is, whether it's celiac or an intolerance, let it keep you from living, let it keep you from being part of the celebration. And so maybe it can't be about the food and you have to modify it, but you still can be a part of the celebration and the community and the connectedness, and to just not let that inhibit you from fully living.
Yeah, that's so good and so true. That food is not just for our survival. You think about the Israelites and even Jesus at the Last Supper, like they were hanging out. It was during food, and every festival had food that was involved. And so there's something that is communal about it. And I think that's a powerful thought. And so not allowing these things to really inhibit our lives, but not, and in your case, not just learning how to manage, but really still thriving, and then now turning it as a resource to others. It's just so very cool. Well, thank you, Heather, for being on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And so you can check out her website, goglutenfreely.com, where she's got a ton of really cool stuff, and I know is adding a bunch all the time to the website. And so again, a really great resource. If you know somebody, if you have celiac, somebody that you're aware of that has celiac, you can recommend that to them. But again, the broader picture of these challenges that we are going to face in life, how we manage them, how we find ways to either deal with them, overcome them, move through them, and what we do then as a result of them. Well, this has been episode 22 of the Nefesh podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.